Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I am Pinar Kip, Executive Vice President and Global Head of the Talent Marketplace for State Street. Welcome to the fourth in a year-long series of conversations about justice, equity, and inclusion, hosted by the Massachusetts and Texas Conferences for Women, State Street, and the Boston Globe. Last week marked a year since the murder of George Floyd, set off most far-reaching reckoning about race, justice, equity, and inclusion we have seen in our lifetimes. This reckoning has reverberated across the nation and the world. It has made itself felt on the streets, in the media, and in our workplaces. In response, some businesses have donated money to help address systemic inequalities. Some have changed their boards. Some have prioritized dialogue and healing. And many have recognized the truth. It takes more than good intentions and best practices to achieve real change. At State Street, we launched our 10 actions against racism and inequality to increase representation and progression of Black and Latinx talent at the highest levels of our organization. We created anti-racism education for our employees and worked on understanding and adopting industry best practices. And while we made tangible progress against these goals, we know that this is a long journey, and it takes continuous learning and open and courageous conversations to get to our destination, like the one we are going to have today. To guide us today through our today's conversation, we are delighted to have with us Michelle Kip, co-founder of Awaken, a leading provider of interactive equity and inclusive education programs, and author of upcoming book, The Wake Up, Closing the Gap Between Good Intentions and Real Change. Michelle reminds us that we can't just hack social justice. Rather, we must build resilient, genuine human connections while we try new things, recover from mistakes, and find our own authentic voice. As a queer immigrant Korean American woman, Michelle has been a lifelong social justice activist. Her work has appeared in the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and the New York Times, and she has been named Medium's top writer in diversity 3 years in a row. She will start today's discussion with remarks and then lead a panel discussion with an esteemed panel of executives, including Trish Foster, Executive Director from the Center for Women and Business at Bentley University, Paul Francisco, Global Chief Diversity Officer and Head of Workforce Development Programs at State Street Corporation, and Donna Tenner, Vice President and Manager of Financial Services, Global Risk Solutions at Liberty Mutual Insurance. I am so excited to get started. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Michelle Kip. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you so much for the intro, Pinar. Hi, everyone. I don't think we can use the chat today, but I feel all the energy, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to share my slides. So for panelists, if you can just confirm that you can see them, that would be very helpful. Oops. Are you able to see my slides?
We are, Michelle.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, so hi again, I'm Michelle. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm soon to be a published author for my first book called The Wake Up, and I am delighted to be here. I'm also the CEO and co-founder of Awaken, as Pinar mentioned, and I'm really excited to kick this session off. We're going to be having an incredible conversation with a really esteemed colleagues and peers in the DEI world. And I'm going to be setting the context a little bit by sharing my journey with Brave Dialogues and also some of the important things that I've taken away for the past few years facilitating these conversations in different organizations. We live in such an interesting time, and I find that the fastest way that we can get somebody to lie to us is this question. Hi, how are you? And when we joined this session, we were asked this question by some of the organizers, and all of our automatic responses were, we're good, we're doing well. And every time somebody asks me this question, hi, how are you? I do all sorts of mental gymnastics to figure out how honest I can be. And in the spirit of being brave, I'm going to share with you and be honest that I'm not doing quite well. The truth is that I am still traumatized by the shooting that happened in Atlanta just 3 months ago. I'm still terrified by the fact that our Asian elders are still getting beaten down in the streets. I'm concerned about the alarming rate of anti-trans bills being introduced across the nation. I'm terrified of the ongoing police brutality. I am saddened by the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I am grieving the millions of losses of lives during this pandemic, including my own grandmother who passed away early this year. So no, I'm not doing so well. And yet here we are doing the best that we can to have conversations that are meaningful and to encourage all of us to be able to connect with each other at a much more human level. And I know that so many of you aren't doing just fine either. And every day I receive messages from people all over the country asking me how they are supposed to go on pretending that everything is returning to normal when they are still healing, when they are still recovering from their traumas, where the society is asking them to heal and compartmentalize in order to function. And I also hear from leaders, and I work with a lot of executives who ask me, how are we supposed to make decisions about which events to address when there are so many things happening? A lot of leaders are also struggling to find the right words to address these events and how to go about fulfilling their promises that they made following the murder of George Floyd in summer 2020. I co-founded my company Awaken in 2017 with this mission to create compassionate space for uncomfortable conversations in order to develop inclusive leaders and teams. Since the founding, I've spent an estimated 2,500 hours on just discovery calls, talking to different organizational leaders, figuring out what their issues are and why they are trying to bring courageous conversations to their workplace. Since the summer of 2020, just 12 months span, we've been reached out by 1,400 organizations asking us for help with creating space for more courageous dialogues. And from having conversations about racism to white supremacy, anti-Asian violence, anti-Black racism, #MeToo, LGBTQ+ issues, we've been having conversations inside organizations and meeting people with great intentions to have conversations and who are willing to dig deeper into the real issues faced by their colleagues. And from all of these conversations across thousands of participants, hundreds of teams, here are some things that we've been able to learn in terms of what holds us back from being able to have these conversations to begin with. And these are some of the common barriers. They're not exhaustive, but the ones that seem prominent and important for me to share with you before we jump into the panel. One is the limitation of language and knowledge. A lot of folks are afraid of saying the wrong thing. I really want to talk about this and I don't want to cause additional harm by saying the wrong thing. So can you tell me what are the things that I should say versus not say? How do we actually begin these conversations? And there's a lot of fear around making mistakes. Some subscribe to what I call the myth of neutrality, where folks are afraid of alienating someone by taking a stand on an issue, when in reality, our not taking a stand can also be a stand that we're taking in and of its own. And some folks believe that talking about politics is inappropriate in the workplace. And from that, I also gather that a lot of folks don't understand the relationship between what is considered political and what is deeply personal for so many marginalized people, and therefore that it impacts the professional space as well. And lastly, in many organizations, there's still a grave lack of psychological safety. And psychological safety is a term coined by Amy Edmondson, a Harvard professor and researcher, who defines it as a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And this lack of psychological safety is felt on behalf of many people. It is felt by people who are marginalized, who don't want to face any negative repercussions or penalty associated with being honest and direct about the concerns that they have about the company culture or policies. And the studies have shown that when women and people of color do speak up, that they are more likely to face negative repercussions and penalty and consequences as a result of advocating for equity and inclusion. And the lack of psychological safety is felt by people who hold many privileged identities as well, because there is this fear of not being able to make any mistakes at all. So on the part of many people, there is this yearning to become closer and to be really connected. And yet we are falling short of having these real conversations that are required for us to build resilient relationships. And even when we get over these hurdles and start having the conversations, we often get stuck by using euphemisms and diluted concepts. So this happens a lot, especially in the corporate space, where we aren't able to use direct, precise language to actually talk about the issues that we need to solve. So for example, it is often that we are asked to conduct a training on unconscious bias, rather than talking about racism more directly, or even white supremacy. And there's a grave amount of discomfort in using precise language to actually tackle the issues that we need to be talking about. And given the fact that we're all coming from different identities, different experiences, different backgrounds, all of us come into this conversation with different contexts, which is prone to clashing when we can't even agree on the problems that we're trying to solve. And lastly, this is something that happens over and over during diversity trainings or conversations, or even the initiatives at large, where the burden of education and emotional labor is disproportionately put on already marginalized people. So while they are having to process the traumas that they're experiencing, they're also being asked to lead these conversations, often without compensation or acknowledgement that this is additional real labor that they're needing to do. And this creates additional amounts of cynicism, disappointment, and breakdown of trust inside organizations. And I believe underneath all of these things, from the barriers to what gets us stuck inside these conversations, is so much fear around being penalized, being misunderstood, or feeling inadequate on the part of everyone that may want to have courageous conversations and form deeper connections. So today's topic is brave dialogues. So I got to thinking, what exactly do we mean by brave? So I turned to the trusted source of Oxford Dictionary and looked up the definition of brave. According to Oxford Dictionary, brave is defined as being ready to face and endure danger or pain, or also known as showing courage. I want us to mull over those words a little bit, that being brave is about facing and enduring danger or pain. And reflecting on this definition, I implore us to think more deeply about what are these dangers and pains that's associated with having brave dialogues, and how might they differ based on our identities, our privileges, and our power. And how can we make sure that we mitigate proactively these dangers or pains that prohibit us from having these honest conversations? And what does that look like? And we're going to go over all of those things during our panel today, but I want us to get started on the 3 things that I want to share with you, and then we'll add to this list. So getting started with brave dialogues, how we might be able to mitigate some of these great dangers and pains associated with having these conversations. First, I think it's really important for us to know the why behind these dialogues. Why are we trying to have these conversations? Is it because we are trying to appease people who want to see some type of action, or is it for us to hold ourselves accountable to our proclaimed values? Is it to educate the most privileged people, or is it to center the needs of the most marginalized people? Even though the solution may be similar, the way that we frame the why, the way that we think about the why, and how we are rooted in the why will dictate the how and the what as well. And the what needs to be really clear. Is this an educational dialogue where we're having conversations in order to raise awareness? Or is this a processing space where we are able to hold space for marginalized people's trauma? Because those are 2 very different outcomes of having conversations around these topics. And it's important that we clarify that and set right expectations so we don't cause inadvertent harm. Second, we need to solve for the safety of the marginalized people rather than the comfort of the privileged. And these two concepts are often conflated, right? Safety versus comfort. Solving for safety is different than solving for comfort. Us feeling unsafe, and especially marginalized people feeling unsafe having these conversations, is not to be mistaken as the uncomfortable feelings that people feel when we are having more direct, honest conversations. So not conflating these concepts is really important. And solving for safety includes things like using more direct and precise language to describe the problems that we're trying to solve that we talked about. So if we're talking about racism or anti-Black racism, let's actually name that as such, and also name white supremacy instead of just unconscious bias. If we're talking about mental health, let's also talk about capitalism and the impact of our grind culture on our mental health. But some of these topics are so taboo in the workplace that we become really hesitant to have these conversations. And solving for safety also includes removing negative repercussions or mitigating them in advance so that there is additional safety for marginalized people to enter into these conversations, and also providing safer spaces to respect their boundaries. And part of this may be that when we are engaging in these conversations, we set very clear ground rules, or community agreements is what we call them, and in making sure that the norm and the culture is set up in such a way that centers the marginalized people's needs. And lastly, we can begin to see people beyond just the issues. I believe that at the core of why we have gone to a place where we can't have honest conversations about DEI and why people are so hesitant to enter these conversations is because we have failed to humanize the work of DEI over and over. I see people wanting to do the right thing and care about the language that they're using and get to feel paralyzed by not having enough knowledge and skills to do so, while we ignore the real human cost of suffering, the pain and the trauma and the grief that we're all holding as human beings that require us to take risks and to be able to connect at a human level beyond intellectualizing these issues. So I think going back to the core of this, that DEI fundamentally is about our human experience that we can all share, and that we need to dig a little bit deeper beyond the best practices of DEI to connecting with each other at a much more human level and seeing each other as expansive humanity, including the suffering with it. I think that we can have much better conversations and more courage to be able to enter into these conversations. And we'll discuss a lot more strategies with other folks on the panel, which I'm really excited to begin. So I'm going to leave you with a couple questions to ponder throughout the panel and to kind of frame the conversations we're going to have. Earlier this week, I shared a post on my social media about my mental health journey. I've been struggling with depression and anxiety for the last 5 years, and I've been in therapy for 4. And I shared more honestly about where I've been as of late, because I think it's really important that we normalize having these conversations. And there is so much, again, fear on the part of people who are sharing, right? Thinking about, is this going to impact my career? Is this going to impact the way that I'm going to be perceived by people? And I wanted to also normalize these types of conversations, specifically about mental health, coming from someone who looks like me, an Asian American woman who identifies as a queer person, who is an immigrant, because these communities tend to have, especially in the Asian community and the immigrant community, mental health is still so stigmatized. So I share this post on social media and received a flood of responses of people thanking me for my courage and for my bravery. Wow, you're so brave for being so honest and vulnerable about your journey. Thank you for doing that. And while I was grateful for the appreciation and affirmations, I got to thinking, what if we lived in a world where we didn't have to be, where we didn't need to be brave in order to be human? What does that world look like? What if we didn't have to get over such dangers and pains in order to be ourselves? and how can we all co-create that space where people can actually be human. So I'm going to transition over to our incredible panel. I am so excited to be in conversations with these people. We have very juicy conversations that we've prepared and from the input from you all who've submitted incredible questions. So with that, I'm going to close out my slides and let's have this conversation. Hello, 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 hello. Hi, Donna, Paul, Trish. Thank you so much for being with us. I am very excited to begin. I'm going to start off our panel with Paul. I'm going to ask you a little bit of your journey about around Brave Dialogues, especially at State Street. So it's my knowledge that this whole series was inspired by the conversation that you had with the Conference for Women last year. And I'm so curious, why did you feel that these conversations are necessary, and what do they look like at your organization?
Thanks, Michelle. And let me start by wishing everyone a happy Pride Month. And B, thanking you, Michelle, for sort of setting up this conversation, which I think is really critically important. You know, so when I think back of how this series got started, and I'll give credit to a lot of people on my team and a lot of people in the Mass Conference for Women and Conference for Women team. We started this conversation with the Mass Conference for Women before George Floyd happened. And there was a need, there was a recognition that the Conference for Women played a critical role in educating folks and creating spaces for folks to have these conversations. And there was a conversation that was centered around the experiences of Black women at the Conference for Women. And that's how this got started, right? So if we are going to create spaces for Black women and co-create spaces with them, we need to understand what they bring to the table and what the fears are, or what the trepidations are about attending what was considered at that point a mainly, white female conference. And that's how this got started. But as it evolved, we realized there was a need for all of us to have a deeper and more honest conversations about how our employees are feeling around in our organizations. And in light of what subsequently happened with George Floyd, luckily at State Street, we had been having these conversations going back 2 years prior to George Floyd. Our Italian American Professionals Network, our Black Professionals Network, Irish Professional Networks got together and started having conversations around race. We invited Robert Johnson of BET fame, the founder of Black Entertainment Television, to have a conversation with our CEO nearly two and a half years ago, to have a conversation around what it was like to be a Black man in corporate America. And so these Brave Dialogues have been happening in many different situations in our organization. They've transformed. You talked, Michelle, about people being brave, right? And being willing to face danger. And I think that what we need to talk about and think about is, are organizations being brave, right? And are they willing to face pain and danger? Because that's really truly what's going to move the needle around this conversation. So, I'm glad to be part of this discussion. I think these are absolutely necessary discussions to be had. At State Street, these conversations are taking place in many different places. I've seen our senior leaders. I've seen actually some senior leaders really, truly break down and expose themselves to their experiences, create the safe spaces for a lot of us who are part of those underrepresented or marginalized groups, however you want to describe us, allowing us to open up and allow us to feel that psychological safety that you talked about. Because we see them sort of, being the ones to say, it's not your responsibility, it's our responsibility to drive this. Now, don't get me wrong, right? There are instances in which we do want to hear from our employees who are marginalized. We do put them in a situation where they have to relive the trauma. We're still growing and learning as an organization. And, and those are things that we are very mindful of because, again, right, psychological safety is in a sense of belonging, this idea of co-creating these spaces is something that all of us have to contribute to. And so I, myself was in a conversation with Kathy Horgan, who is our CHRO, and Lou Maiori, who's our CEO, president of the organization, having a conversation about a year later after George Floyd, right? How do we all feel? They were able to sort of open up personally what they meant for them and what is done for them and the way they think about these issues and these type of conversations and what is their role in trying to drive change in our organization. So I didn't feel like I had to relive and share my trauma, right, of the last year. And like you, Michelle, there are a lot of things I'm still concerned with. A lot of things are still forefront, in my mind and in my experience about being a man of color, an Afro-Latino in Boston during this time. So I'll stop there, but I am so excited to have this conversation with both Trish, Donna, and with you, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. I have a lot of follow-up questions to what you just said, but I'm going to hold and come back to you. But I really appreciate the fact that you're pointing to the leadership and driving the space and the culture in order for us to all be able to be brave about these conversations. And I also really appreciate you highlighting the difference between educating, but also the re-traumatizing of marginalized people in these conversations. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go to Trish next. And I really appreciate our prep conversation in which you were so open about being direct about the identities that you hold. And you hold multiple different identities as a cisgender, straight, white woman. And I'm curious about how those identities have shaped your experience navigating these conversations and how you've been able to create spaces for brave dialogues.
Michelle, thank you so much. And again, a warm shout out to everybody else who's on the call and of course all the attendees here. It's really a privilege to be here with all of you today. So this is so personal for all of us, right? And that's why I think we had that conversation before the panel today where I said, look, we all have to show up with our own intersectional identities and bring those to the party to make progress together. That's the only way we're going to. And so, yeah, I have, among many other identities, I'm a white woman, I'm cisgender. And so I feel like what I've had to learn to do in navigating these conversations that are so important in my organization as well, and mesh directly with allyship, right? Is how do I show up with these conversations trying to be a white ally to, people who may identify as BIPOC or AAPI, right? So what do I do? Well, the most important thing I think I've learned is to move away from rationalizing my own positions, explaining my own positions, and getting in a place where I'm just carefully listening to learn and bringing humility. And these sound simple, but until you start to really examine your own behavior and dig deep, you don't really understand that you're not always doing that, right? Because we're all showing up with good intent. I never did not show up with good intent. But I don't think that always converted to holding a learning stance, not rationalizing, not explaining my viewpoint when it wasn't completely aligned with someone else's, and just sitting and listening with compassion and empathy. And learning that I often inadvertently center myself and my whiteness, right? And so I've really learned not to do that. And that doesn't mean I still don't make mistakes and still don't do it, but I'm aware and I'm working at it. And, an example I have, and it's sort of a benign one, but I think it helps illustrate it really well, goes back a few years ago. I was in a conversation with a Black woman who shared a really poignant story about her first experience with overt discrimination around her race. Now here, she has the vulnerability to share this with me, and she doesn't even know me that well. And it was sad. And I cried. And I know that this is nuanced. This is why this is all hard and we have to talk about it. There is no perfect script for these conversations. It's not always wrong to cry. I was being authentic. Yet, looking back now and over the years since, I've become more aware about checking my own emotion. Because what happened is I let the energy shift in that conversation to a focus on me and my fragility and away from her. And that's just something I work much harder at now. And I hope I succeed more often now in being sure that that person from an underrepresented group who's engaging in a brave dialogue with me is not being put in a position of protecting my fragility. I've also really learned to apologize. Again, how basic, but we make mistakes. I keep making them. And I've learned that even if I don't completely disagree with the person on the other side of the table, I still need to apologize because I do know that on some level I've hurt them. Again, even if we're not aligned, even if we don't see eye to eye, if something I have done or said has caused them hurt, I owe them an apology, and that comes from an authentic place for me. And, you know, often leads to my being able to say, and do you wish to share more? And not putting the onus on them to tell me more, but inviting them to share if they would wish to do so. And, you know, I think one of the best ways I can show up better in brave dialogues as a person who's usually in the in group is putting myself in a place where I remember the moments I haven't been in the in group, right? And we all have those moments. For me, it might be around my gender or power dynamics or health or age. What does that feel like? Well, I know that there have been times where I've had to engage in brave dialogue from that position, and I have felt very vulnerable, and I have felt fear. And I have needed that person on the other side of the table to bring compassion and empathy. And I think that if we all do that before we engage in brave dialogue, we will bring our humility to the table and our empathy to the table so that others can speak their truth. And I think that's just so important.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being vulnerable with your mistakes. That's not an easy thing to do in these conversations. And I really want to highlight just sort of the amount of inner work that goes into being able to have productive and fruitful conversations where everybody can actually create space for the issues that we're trying to solve, which at the core of it is centering the needs of marginalized people and creating equitable, more inclusive environments. And I'm, you know, the question that I want to come back to you with, and maybe you can think about this as you're, as we go through other questions, is I'm curious how you've been able to systematize some of these concepts and learnings that you are having, right? So much of the experience of marginalized people, and especially people of color in the workplace around these conversations, is centering the comfort of white people, right? And when you talk about the defensiveness and the fragility and the centering of their experience at the expense of others, I think those are some things that a lot of folks struggle with in their own companies. So I'm curious what kind of work has been done in order to create that environment where we can accelerate that education so that when we all gather, that it's an experience that can feel safer and respectful and honoring of the pain that people are going through. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. Donna, I know your experience having these conversations came about pretty organically, and you've kind of been at the center of creating this groundswell of people wanting to have these conversations at Liberty Mutual. So I'm curious if you are able to share how that journey was, how it started, and how it's going right now.
And so just like the other panelists, thank you so much for having me be part of such an esteemed panel. I will say that I had a little bit of imposter syndrome with all of these DE&I professionals and consultants and everything. And I view myself as kind of like a grassroots practitioner, right? And still with a journey to go, but I hope that, you know, my story at least will make some of the people that are attending that don't know where to start or feel that they are not expert enough, maybe they'll feel a little bit more inspired to get started in their own organization. So I manage a nationwide team of finance professionals. It's about 350 people from all walks of life in most of the 50 states. And you know, after the killing of George Floyd last year, I really sat with my feelings for a little while, and I called some of my team, and I called some colleagues, and I've always had a circle of trust, right? People who know that I'm a white passing woman of color, people who have been with me through many years of working, who have been with me, and I feel that I can share my own misgivings, my own fears. But I realized that I was really just playing it safe. I was talking to people who were like an echo chamber of my own feelings. They were going to be supportive. And I didn't have to work very hard, if it were, to just talk to this small group of people in my circle. And I realized it was my responsibility to create a space for my entire team to be in a circle of trust. I had to create a safe space. I had to host a safe space for my organization to feel like they could come and they could be vulnerable. They could share how they were feeling. They could share their fears. They could ask for education from their colleagues and receive it. And you know, and it was frightening, honestly. When I sent out that meeting invite to my team, and I said, I'm you know, this is an optional meeting, but you know, I would very much like to share with you what I'm going through, and also hear from you, and hope that we can support each other. You know, we set some ground rules very early because I think that's really important to create a safe space. We don't record, we don't prepare content, we don't. And we also make it optional because I do realize people are at different phases of their openness to listening and learning. And, you know, even our first meeting, and I think I gave maybe my team 48 hours of notice, right? Put it on a calendar, 48 hours. We had over 100 attendees with such a short amount of time. And, you know, we had people sharing their experiences, asking questions of each other. We have guidelines for inclusion at Liberty Mutual that specifically kind of outline what does an inclusive environment look like. And so it's things like, you don't blame and shame people, you know, you really think about, it's not either or, it can be both and, you know, two opinions can coexist in the same world, and there's truth to that. And, you know, we've been holding them every other month. We always have well over 100 attendees. We've talked about a number of issues. You know, I hate to say sometimes we have them right after there's a terrible event in the news, which I would hope we eventually get to the point where we don't have to talk through a terrible event because they're not happening. But right now we do. And I think as a team, we've become stronger. We had a shared identity of we are responsible for you know, business results. We are responsible to each other as work colleagues to share work and support each other from a work perspective. But this shared experience, we found ways to talk to each other, to relate to each other as human beings. And also we found so much more common ground that we would never have had if we hadn't created this space. And so I call it unlike, I do sometimes have calls where I call them office hours. Call in and you can talk to me about a work thing. So we actually call these open hours. So my job is not to present or facilitate, but really to host. So it's open, it's what people want to talk about, and it's my job to make sure we keep our guidelines for inclusion in mind, that people feel safe sharing, and people feel safe attending and not sharing or participating at all, and just listening. No one is under any obligation to speak. And so it really creating that space is, and the kind of the grassroots of it is that people talk. I went to it and you did, and other people hear that it was actually not a unsafe environment. And so more and more people come because they feel like there's only upside to them to attending in terms of learning, and that there's no penalty for coming and not engaging. So we've just really had wonderful experience with it. And honestly, the very first one, I was worried, like, am I doing something wrong? Am I doing something I'm not equipped to manage? Is it going to quickly get out of hand and I'm not going to be able to to bring us all back, or the genie's going to be out of the bottle and I don't know how to manage this? And instead, we should just have more faith that our folks want to help each other and want to be supportive of each other and want to learn and want to share. And if anything, I've just become more and more and more proud of my organization and my teammates.
Thank you for sharing that journey. It's really, it gives me a lot of hope hearing the word of mouth nature of how you're going about doing this, in inviting maybe people who are skeptical about having these conversations, coming around on their own to decide that they want to be a part of it. And I think that goes to show the importance of just trying and actually getting into the waters and knowing that you may not have all the answers, but we're trusting in the humanity of the people to be able to hold space for these conversations. And I also love that the beginning of the conversation that you started was that your own, that you were having this reflection, a deep reflection of, I want to have these conversations in order for us to have deeper connections with each other. So I think all of these things are really important lessons. And I also love that you said both and. It's one of my favorite tools that I use when I'm facilitating. And I think the important thing here is, I think, the discernment between what can coexist and what cannot. Right? Like the fact that I am a person of color and I hold multiple privileges, those are both and, right? They can coexist at the same time. And I just love that we're making space for these expansive topics. So thank you for sharing your journey. So all three of you have, very sort of grounded stories of why this is important. And all three of you in different ways mentioned the importance of the leaders' roles in this, in shaping the conversations and also creating space where we can take risks. So I'm curious from any of you what your thoughts are in terms of the responsibility of leaders, and especially the C-suite leaders, in creating these spaces more proactively inside companies. And what are, the biggest question I get from leaders is, when do we have these conversations, right? So often, like Donna said, it's after a grave tragedy that people feel motivated to have these conversations, and sometimes that motivation dies down. So I'm curious about the entire arc of what gets people and what gets leaders invested in having these conversations, and what does the follow through look like on the part of the leaders? Anyone can start.
So maybe I'll throw something out there, which I think that we tend to forget, that our leaders are people just like us, and that they also need to go through their own journey. They also need to understand what their blind spots are, what their biases are, and they have a special requirement, right, to show up and to show up for those that are the most impacted in the organizations in one way or another. And so I would tell you that they have a great responsibility to speak up, to advocate, and to use their platform to make sure that those of us who feel the least included do feel part of the rest of the organization. And, there is an arc in terms of how leaders should be addressing issues, whether it's a topical issue or something that happened, whether it's, the invasion of our Capitol on January 6th, whether it's the killing of George Floyd, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the killing of the Asian women in Atlanta, the war on voting rights, right? There is a responsibility that these leaders have to address this. And the reason why is because you have more than likely, you have members of those groups who are part of your organization who are sitting there saying, is this important to my company? Is this important to my leader? Are they going to address what's happening? Or are they going to ignore it? And often we say to people, bring yourselves to work, right? We are a culture that invites you to bring your whole self to work.
That's right.
You know, and then when you really start to dissect what that really means, is all right, so you want me to bring my full self to work. Part of my full self is the baggage that I bring every day to work, right? And part of that are the worries that I feel. Part of that are the concerns that I have for my physical, you know, emotional well-being and safety, and that and health of my loved ones. And so if I'm doing that, what are you going to do about it, right? To protect me, to make me feel better, to ensure that those things don't interfere with the way I do my work, don't interfere with the way I am able to succeed in this organization. And in order to do that, our leaders need to be equipped with the knowledge, you know, and the proximity to these issues, right? And understanding from the employee's perspective. So part of the arc is, you know, how much time is your leader spending with these groups? You know, is she or he understanding of these issues deeply, personally, right? Do they understand what is expected of them? And so are these conversations happening in a consistent and constant basis versus just, oh my goodness, a tragedy happened, I need to address it, what do I say? Mm-hmm. Right. So part of the secret here is that they need to be consistently listening to their employees, understanding what is on their minds and understanding their experiences, and then bringing that forth, you know, as part of their own, you know, evolution, on education. And so we have to spend a lot of time for those of us, and Donna, by the way, all of us are diversity practitioners and all of us are experts in one way or another. So please don't feel that that we have all the answers, because we don't. And often I say to my leaders, they are the ones who we are looking for to lead, right? They are the ones who we are looking for answers. And if we want to build more resilient organizations, more successful organizations, these leaders need to understand how to lead in times of crisis around these issues, but also to lead, you know, and in terms of the issues in general, right? So that's one part of the arc. I think the you know, I say the light at the end of the tunnel for a lot of our leaders is that they're getting more and more comfortable with speaking out, speaking up, with advocating, with sort of using their platform, personal and professional, and the company's platform to advocate for issues that are of utmost importance to, you know, society at large, or to a group of employees, whether it's trans rights, again, whether it's voting rights, right? Whether it's you name it, API, hate, and any other issue that may be happening, racism. And so I can speak for my own CEO. He's very much using his platform to speak out against these issues, despite the fact that they may have negative blowback, right? From folks saying, why are you speaking about this, right? Is it, you know, is it your, you know, place to be doing so? And he's saying, yes, it is. And whether you like it or not, I do have a personal opinion, whether you like it or not, I do believe that these larger social issues are issues that impact our companies. And therefore, I'm going to speak out against them, or speak up. And so I think that we have, our leaders have a special duty to address these issues consistently, right? Not just when things happen, but consistently, and understand how the employees are feeling about it.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
Paul is right on. Thank you, Paul. And I'd love to add to that a little bit. And I think you're doing such a good job of framing what leaders need to be doing. I want to back up a little bit and say, I think some folks out there might be wondering, how do we get them on board when they're not quite on board? I know that that's a question I get in the work I do with businesses all the time. And I would say that there's a lot we can do, but some easy go-tos are educate them with data and with real employee stories. And Paul kind of alluded to that, but like, they've got to know what their employees are experiencing. Think about personal coaches for leaders, to really help educate them on these issues. And one of my personal favorites is reverse mentoring. Nothing helps a leader who can get really removed from the folks on the ground in understanding what the lived experience is of one of their AAPI folks, one of their BIPOC folks, somebody who's gay. And a great quick story I'll share that really illustrates this is from a large international firm that I've worked with that used reverse mentoring for their CEO, and a young gay employee reverse mentored this person. And they said, what we learned is that the CEO needed psychological safety to learn. And the employee literally said he wasn't homophobic or anything. He was a good guy. He just didn't get it. He needed to hear my experience. He needed to see an example in front of him. And I was able to do that. And at the end, his conclusion was, wow, now I know why I need to get more involved. And now I know why I need to be visibly involved. And I think that drives it home, how we need to get our leaders on board. I know we're going to run short on time. I could go on saying that I do have a cautionary tale, which is that you're not going to get all leaders on board. And I think we would be inauthentic if we didn't share that with our listeners and say, sometimes you don't. And that's a critical issue, and one that, Michelle, I'll leave it to you to decide whether you want to make time for us to unpack that or go elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is an important conversation. And I recently wrote about this, where sometimes we end up focusing so much on converting the minds of people who are not wanting to be changed. And so much of our efforts go into that conversation of how do we get people to care, that we forget about all the people who already care, who want to do the right thing, who want to be involved, who want to grow and learn. And we miss a lot of the opportunities to actually create change by focusing on the most influential part of the business. So I do appreciate you naming that. And from both you and Paul, I think what I'm also hearing is this balance between having people in positions of power, understanding the importance of the employee experience, because that is their responsibility. And also having structures that enable that conversations to happen, that doesn't, to Paul, your point earlier, doesn't put that disproportionate burden without consent on people who are marginalized to excavate their trauma in order to educate. So I think it's always this fine balance between those two things. I know we're really close to end time already. And we've already actually covered some of the questions that have come up from the audience, including how do we get leaders to actually care? How do we make space for these direct conversations to happen? I want to go to Donna and have you sort of share some of the learnings that you've had and any pitfalls that you think people should be watching out for.
So I think one thing that I've learned, and I grew up at Liberty Mutual, if you will. I've been there 24 years and started there right out of grad school. And you get used to, as a manager or a leader of an organization, you get used to being the person with all the answers when it comes to your work. Like, you're the path of escalation when something's not going well in the office or a decision has to be made, and things come to you almost as, you're the buck stops with you. Like, you're the one with all the answers. And in theory, you're supposed to be more expert than your employees on the tasks of work. But I think we all have to accept that when it comes to bias and intolerance, the leader can't be that person and shouldn't be that person, right? Everyone has their own lived experience. Everyone has experienced, most people not maybe everyone, but most people have experienced bias and intolerance in their lives. But that's just one perspective. It's just one set of experiences, and you can't speak for everyone else. And so you almost have to flip the dynamic, which is, I'm willing to be a learner. I'm willing to ask questions. I'm willing to be vulnerable, as kind of Trish was mentioning. And that I love the reverse mentoring concept of like, let the more junior employee potentially be the one that teaches you, and be willing to be vulnerable and humble about learning. Because when you have this power dynamic where I'm more senior, I'm the manager, and you're the employee, that power dynamic can really get in the way of true conversations. You have to reduce the distance. And part of that is saying what you don't know, and hoping that someone is willing to help you. But if they're not, you have to that's no excuse. You still need to do your own education. We're a little spoiled at Liberty Mutual in that we have amazing employee resource groups, and those teams are staffed with people who are willing to educate and share their stories and provide resources. So we're a little spoiled in that we have that shortcut, which I know a lot of companies maybe don't have that. And but you have to think of yourself, even based on your own identity. You may have like this whole narrative about yourself, but you can be an ally to so many other groups, and it starts with you, and you have to do the work and not expect people to spoon feed it to you.
Yes.
So that would be probably the biggest pitfall, is just to expect that, because as a leader, most people kind of like present things to you to make decisions, or to escalate for advice. In this particular instance, you have to be willing to carry your own bag. You have to be willing to do the work, and you have to you really have to be okay with really reducing the distance and being the student again. The only other pitfall I would really think about is, to your point about consistency. If you show up once and that's the only time you ever show up, people remember that, and they remember that it was performative. They view it as you just did it because you felt you had to check the box, move on. You have to be consistent, and not just with the big splashy, panels or speeches or communications, but in that around your dinner table, around your work dinner table, whether it's virtual or in real life, you have to kind of always be that person, not just when the cameras are on, or not just when you're in the spotlight.
Oh, I love that. You said a lot of things that really resonated in terms of, balancing both the listening, but also doing your own work, right? Carry your own bag. I love that phrase. And not always putting the burden of educating someone on already marginalized people. I love that balance. And I also think that, the consistency that we all speak of is so important to not being performative in these moments. And also making sure that these brave dialogues end with certain changes, that we're not just having conversations for the sake of conversations, but that leaders with power really have the opportunity to shape the organizations through policies and culture change that can last beyond this conversation. We are 2 minutes away from finishing this conversation, and I want to leave on a note of hope and joy. So if everybody can share, what is one thing that brings you hope or joy during this trying time? We're not used to talking about hopeful, joyful things, are we?
I'll go ahead and go first. I think for me, it is many moments that I am seeing doing this work, this DEI work, but also out there just living a normal life as a human. More and more sensitivity to people's unique identities. And yes, I know, we all know there's the sadness and the trauma and the negativity, but there are also those moments of hope, as you just so beautifully said, Michelle, where real sensitivity is being shown to our unique differences and identities that are often hidden.
Yeah.
And an understanding that they're often hidden. So intersectionality in a nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Trish.
For me, it gives me hope that a year, almost exactly to the date last week of George Floyd's killing. This topic is still very much alive. These conversations are still very much alive. And we continue to hold ourselves accountable and leaders accountable. And I think that it's not going away anytime soon. So that gives me hope. And joy is to see a lot of my friends, colleagues, and their desire to be allies. To me, that gives me joy, right? Because they are willing to put themselves in a vulnerable position. They are willing to, amplify our voices. They are willing to take on the work. And I've seen many of them step up in ways I haven't seen before, quite frankly. And I see the consistency of it, right? And they're showing up time after time. And that gives me both joy and hope that we're finally going to arrive at a place where we can start doing some of the work. So,
yes.
Not arrive at a place where the work is done, but we can start doing some of the work in the right way.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. Donna?
For me, I've been with the same company for a long time, and how I showed up at work and what we talked about 24 years ago compared to how I show up at work and what we talk about now is night and day. And so I get so much more joy from being my authentic self with my employees than I might have been 20 years ago, where I felt the need to conform and fit a certain mold that was expected. So that gives me a lot of joy just to have not a lot of difference between my work self and my life self. And it gives me hope too, that even institutions with long histories and deeply embedded cultures have opportunities to change and grow, and that you can evolve your culture and really create space for people. So I have a lot of hope about that.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really hopeful, and it gives me a lot of joy to think about our younger generation of people and just how much passion and also commitment to accountability and equity our young people are driving as they enter the workforce, and how we are making room for ensuring that they are feeling safe and they belong, and that we're listening, that leaders are finally listening, and that this is consistently, hopefully the consistency will continue. But I believe that our young people will make sure that we are held accountable. So thank you so much for this lovely conversation. Thank you everybody for tuning in. It's such an honor to have been a part of this conversation. And I also want to thank the sponsors of the session, Massachusetts and Texas Conferences for Women, State Street, and the Boston Globe. You're going to receive an email soon with a recording of the session, and be on the lookout for the next conversation in the series. Thank you all so much.